This is a CBS News special report. I'm Katie Couric at CBS News headquarters here in New York. There's been a plane crash here in New York City, and right now you're looking at live pictures of a U.S. Airways jetliner that went down in the Hudson River, an Airbus 320 Flight 1549. Now, it had just taken off from LaGuardia Airport. It was bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. According to reports, it struck a bird apparently and then went down in the Hudson. Earlier pictures showed the entire plane, the fuselage, really floating on the Hudson River, and police were evacuating what appeared to be several passengers who were wearing life vests. But now, as you can see from those live pictures, there's only the tail of the plane emerging from the Hudson River. Bob Orr has been covering and getting details of what transpired. Bob, what are you hearing and what are you learning so far?
Well, Katie, the information right now is still, as you might imagine, preliminary. But according to the FAA, this is a flight, an Airbus A320, capable of carrying just over 100 people. Taking off from LaGuardia, as far as we can tell, it took off a little bit late. It was supposed to take off at 2:45. Didn't get off till somewhere around 3:30. Apparently, it did get airborne because it went at least some distance from the runway at LaGuardia until it landed in the Hudson River. And I can tell you from looking at the pictures, a couple of things come to my mind. Number one, the plane had to be under some control. It seems that it has hit relatively flat, which looks to me more like a ditching than an actual crash from altitude. But again, that's somewhat speculative. We do know, as you said, there were a number of people that had come out of the plane. They were standing on the wings and awaiting rescue, and there are a number of watercraft around aiding in the rescue. We do not know exactly the destination. Preliminarily, we were told that this flight had taken off from LaGuardia. It was en route to Charlotte, but I would emphasize we're still trying to pin that down. It is Flight 1549. We do not know how many people were on board. The FAA says there's at least a preliminary report, presumably from the airplane itself, of a bird strike right after takeoff. Now, we don't know if the bird hit one of the engines or if perhaps the bird hit the cockpit glass, but either of those things on takeoff can be a very, very problematic event. But as I said before, it seems to me, at least preliminarily, that the pilots must have maintained some control, and that would augur to be at least some good news. Katie?
And of course, the Hudson River is not far from LaGuardia Airport. The East River, of course, lines up next to the airport, and in fact, one of the runways goes into to that river. But as we mentioned, this is the Hudson, which is further away from LaGuardia. And as I mentioned earlier, Bob, the fuselage seemed intact and was floating above the water for some period of time until it became submerged. And according to the AP, Bob, an eyewitness, Barbara Zambrinsky, said, quote, "I just thought, why is it so low?" And splash, it hit the water. So as you mentioned, it sounds like it might have been, the plane might have purposely ditched the flight into the water rather than risk anything else. How often do these bird strikes happen, Bob, by the way?
Bird strikes are somewhat rare, and when they happen at altitude, they can be more of a nuisance than a problem. A bird strike right at takeoff is a very serious event. If a bird gets sucked into one of the jet engines and it's at a critical point of the takeoff, it's possible that the pilots don't have enough power to maintain good flight. It could also tip the plane out of a good configuration, and it can essentially lose lift. I doubt that both of the engines failed. The preliminary report the FAA had was that both engines failed. That would really be quite something. Going through a flock of birds, it's conceivable that could happen, but it's more likely to be a singular problem. What the eyewitness said, I would say two things about that. Number one, eyewitnesses aren't always the most reliable, but her account is consistent with what I see in the pictures. Because I can tell you this, Katie, the Hudson River is at least some distance from LaGuardia, and if the plane had come down from altitude, we could expect something of a fuselage crack or some kind of damage. The fact that it landed relatively flat, I think, is more than just good luck. I think the pilot, as I suggested earlier, very likely had some control, and that might make a very, very big difference in the outcome here.
Yeah, and now, of course, what is scary about this scenario, Bob, it's unclear how many of the passengers were able to get out in time. But as we see surrounding the plane, we see a lot of boats. For example, the Circle Line, which is really used as a tour boat for people who want to just kind of see New York City from the Hudson River. And we see another tour boat to the left, as well as some tugboats, and there were some helicopters that were circling a little bit earlier. But obviously, these boats will be helpful in terms of transporting the passengers from the airplane to to a safe area. And hopefully we'll get somebody from the New York City Police or Fire Department on the line with us momentarily so we can find out sort of the status of the rescue efforts. But it seems to me that there were a lot of people who were photographed earlier getting out of the plane wearing life vests. So hopefully if they had a pretty methodical evacuation procedure, that will be good news. But it is, I mean, you see how in one piece this airplane seems to be, right, Bob?
Katie, I think a couple of things are important here. Number one, the flight crew may have had at least a couple of seconds to warn passengers as to what was going on. That could prepare people. The life vests, as you mentioned, are right underneath the seat. And there are plenty of exit points on the airplane. There are exits over the wing. I know many of you have been on airplanes. You've heard that flight safety demonstration, which most people try to tune out, but they are serious demonstrations. And they explain that people in the middle can exit over the wings. There are also two exits in the front of the plane, and at least the nose in the picture I just saw is still somewhat above water. So it's reasonable to say if they had time to pop those wing doors and they had time to pop the doors in the front, and there was an orderly evacuation in relatively shallow water, we would point out, that there could be a very good outcome here. We did see a number of people outside, both standing near the airplane on the wings and also on some of the rescue lines, including the circle line that you mentioned. So I think we don't want to get too far out speculatively, but the federal investigators are just now getting their first brief on this. As soon as we get more information, we'll come back to you with some further information. But this is the kind of crash that is survivable. People practice, airlines practice, and flight crews practice all the time, getting everybody out of an airplane within 90 seconds. It's a key part of certification. No airliner can go into service unless it can be evacuated safely within 90 seconds. Now, just in the time we've been on the air, and that's been considerably longer than that, we've seen doors still open. So it's reasonable to believe that people inside had a chance to get out. Katie?
And we should mention, Bob, of course, frigid temperatures that are enveloping so much of the country. The same is true of New York City today. Extremely high winds and, of course, the wind chill factor making the weather seem even much more brutal than it normally would. So obviously concerns about hypothermia and other issues with the cold weather, something that probably these rescue workers are very worried about at this point in time.
It's a very good point. I've been out, Katie, with Coast Guard rescue operations actually in January and February in some of the cold weather months, and we know how brutally cold it is in the Northeast today. And frankly, your survivability in cold water is measured in minutes, not a lot longer than that. So people that do not get fairly quick shelter, some kind of warm clothes, some kind of dry, safe harbor, can face some real peril. So I think it's a very, very valid point to say that at the time this went down, those waters of the Hudson are very, very cold. So a quick evacuation would have been key.
All right. And as we can see, as I mentioned before, these sort of cruise ships, if you will, are sort of circling the wreckage, and I'm wondering if some of these ferry boats and sort of tourist boats are being used in the evacuation process. If some of the people, the Circle Line actually seemed to be full of a number of people as we looked at it earlier, which is, you can't see it now, but it was to the right of our screen. If some of the passengers were in fact evacuated to that boat and they're waiting to try to retrieve more if in fact that is the case. And hopefully, as you say, Bob, it's all speculation, but those earlier pictures of people in their life vests on top of the wings and the fuselage of the plane were actually led to safety by rescue workers. But it's too really hard to say right now because we really don't know what's going on at this point in time.
I want to emphasize too, Katie, for people that may be just joining us, this is obviously, unfortunately, a very, very rare event. The FAA says that they believe a bird strike was the precipitating factor here, what started this plane towards the water. We just talked to longtime safety investigators who suggested to us that a single bird is not likely to bring down a large jetliner like an A320. However, a flock of birds very low to the ground could cause quite a problem. In a number of airports, I think LaGuardia is one of them, they have noise-making devices that sound somewhat like shotguns or gunshots that sporadically go off during the day, and it's strictly for the reason to get rid of birds. Birds near the end of runways can be quite perilous. So again, if it turns out that this was a bird strike, this will launch a major federal investigation because it's been a long time concern that's not been blamed on very many crashes. It has been blamed on a number of incidents in the past.
Yeah, and this seems to be an appropriate theory, but LaGuardia Airport, Bob, of course, as you and I both know, has had some problems in the past in terms of the length of the runway, particularly in inclement weather. And remember the flight that actually went off the runway there just a number of years ago because it couldn't get airbound, or there was some concern that the runway at LaGuardia, particularly one that uses the shuttle flights, is simply too short.
You know, there has been a problem in the past at a number of airports. LaGuardia is one, D.C. Reagan is another, where short runways have posed a problem. The newer airplanes, though, and this is a relatively newer airplane, I think, they do not take a long rollout period, and an A320 at LaGuardia is a routine event. It's much like a 737. It can take off quite easily, and it does all the time. We should make a couple of points, Katie, a couple of things that are important. This is a very reliable airplane. The A320 has been a workhorse for Airbus. It's one of the most widely used planes in the world. It has an impeccably good safety record. That's number one. Number two, U.S. Airways and its partners, and I'm not sure if this is U.S. Airways as the parent or one of the code share partners, also has a very, very good safety record. In the 90s, U.S. Airways went through a spate of accidents.
I remember.
And it led to a lot of federal regulations and re-examinations. But since then, even in down financial times, where there have been some real financial pressures on things like maintenance and outsourcing of maintenance, the major airlines, and U.S. Airways is among them, have done a very, very good job. In fact, we've just gone through one of the safest, if not the safest, 2-year period in commercial aviation. I mean, that just ended 2 days ago. So this is a very, very unusual, thankfully, unusual event. And again, we're still waiting to find out what the outcome is. But preliminarily, I would be somewhat optimistic that this was both a survivable event and one that was somewhat managed by the pilots involved.
And it sounds like just sort of a freak accident of sorts, Bob. And right now, Bob, I'm sure you'll want to listen, but Joyce Corderos, who's the 60 Minutes producer, is near the crash site. And Joyce, can you give us any information? Because at this point, it's very difficult to ascertain what's going on.
Well, I'll tell you, when I first looked out, when I actually got to see the plane go into the water, and I was really shocked. I was at the 60 Minutes building, which has large windows that you can look right into the Hudson, and I was shocked to see a plane and in the water. So I ran over, and I saw the flotation device open up. We got some binoculars and looked at the plane itself as it was still floating, as it was still in the water.
Right.
And there were no rescue vehicles there yet. And we saw, I would say, a few dozen people on the actual aircraft wings. They had made it out. And within a few minutes, we did see some rescue boats, it looked like, head over and help folks. And then within, I would say, the next 10, 15 minutes, it sort of became a movie-like scene where many boats sort of surrounded the plane. The plane kept sinking until we no longer saw it.
And how long was it, Joyce? Could you tell it was actually on top of the water? It was probably, what would you say, 10 to 15 minutes? Or is it hard for you to say because you simply noticed it when it was on the water? Did you hear anything?
I didn't hear anything. It's pretty soundproof. But I did think that it took about 10 to 15 minutes for it to actually sort of start sinking. It did float for a little bit.
And did you actually see some of the passengers get from the top of the plane or the wings with their life vests on and see them actually get moved to some of the surrounding boats?
When I was actually on the binoculars, what I saw were folks on the wings, but as other colleagues of mine were shocked by the same news, they came in and the binoculars were passed around. So I didn't see folks get on the rescue vehicle, but I'm sure other people in my office got to do that.
And there were a lot of helicopters in the area, at least 2 that I saw sort of circling the wreckage. Did you see them as well?
I did see them as well. I'm telling you, Katie, it looked like a movie scene. Nothing that would be part of reality.
Yeah, did it look like the helicopters were involved in the rescue efforts at all to you, Joyce?
It seemed more like they were possibly news choppers. I wasn't sure. I definitely saw more of the rescue effort through ferries and boats that sort of rushed and circled the plane completely.
Wow. Well, it is quite a scene. And Bob, does that information help you glean anything more about what might have happened here today?
Well, it's really hard to say, Katie. I think that description underlines, I think, some optimism to me in the way the plane came down, the way it sat there for a while before it started to sink. We've got a little more information, which I would again emphasize is preliminary. So
and Bob, can I just interrupt?
That.
And you may have the
Yes.
same information, but in case you didn't, I think this is a very important thing to impart to our viewers, is that police say they have gotten everyone off the plane, which of course is good news indeed. And I'm not sure if that's what you wanted to tell us as well, Bob.
No, actually, that trumps what I had, Katie. That is very good news. I'm not surprised. I'm very, very heartened to hear that. But it's more amazing when you listen to this. We got one source now preliminarily saying that the aircraft, which was en route to Charlotte and then on to Seattle, may have had as many as 151 people on board.
Wow.
151, which for an A320, by my rough math, is just about maxed out. That's just about every seat. We are looking also, Katie, at a website which we sometimes use to track airplanes, and it shows that this plane, and again, I'm trusting that this is preliminary, but probably close to accurate, it was airborne for about 6 minutes. So that means the pilot may have been trying to troubleshoot. It hit an altitude, a maximum altitude of 3,200 feet, when it apparently went through some kind of flock of birds. So again, the eyewitness saying the plane was very, very low, couldn't understand why it was low, and then it was coming down to the water. This tells me, and I'm going to go out on the limb here, that the pilots perhaps did a very heroic job here of putting the plane down in a relatively soft place.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So it was only airborne, as you said, according to this website, Bob, and I'm not sure if you have a camera on that website that would be interesting for viewers, but it was only airborne for 6 minutes?
Yeah, this is a website which tracks all the commercial air flights around the country, and unfortunately I don't have the capacity to show it to you right now, but according to the data, the raw data, it shows the airplane taking off at about 3:03. It's airborne about 6 minutes. Maximum altitude, it's very low, only 3,200 feet. And we now have heard from a second federal official, I think, that the airplane, in fact, lost both engines. Now, if that turns out to be true, I can tell you unequivocally, this had to be a flock of birds. It's not one or two birds. So this obviously was a flock of large birds in order to take out two engines of a very large airplane, an A320. You may not know, most people may not know what that is. That's a twin-engine plane, single-aisle plane, about the size of a 737 and widely used. So this is quite a remarkable event. And Katie, your information that everyone has made it out safely, according to authorities there, makes it a miraculous event in my mind. And there you saw the graphic of the A320. It's a large airplane.
Yeah, because the notion of people actually in the Hudson River and not even having to wait to be rescued in these kind of bitterly cold temperatures would be a very frightening notion. So Bob, again, I'm just going to reiterate what you told me. It left around 3:03. It was airborne for only 6 minutes, 151 passengers aboard. As Joyce Corderas told us, she saw a lot of those passengers on top of the fuselage and wing. But according to authorities, and of course this is the most important piece of information of all the people aboard or on board that aircraft, according to police and initial reports, have made it out of the plane safely. So it is really a miraculous rescue effort and a miraculous effort, as you said, a heroic effort by those pilots who were able to land the plane and to not have it break up into many pieces and cause more casualties or injuries. So just to repeat for our viewers, a U.S. Airways jetliner has crashed into the Hudson River here in New York City. That is just off Manhattan. It was flight number 1549. It was bound for Charlotte, North Carolina, took off just after 3 Eastern time. As I mentioned, it was due in Charlotte just before 5. New York City firefighters have been evacuating passengers from the Airbus 320 as it floats in the river. But now, of course, as you can see from these pictures, it is submerged into the Hudson. 151 passengers and 146 passengers and 5 crew members on board, therefore 151 in all. And as we mentioned, everyone apparently made it out safely. The plane apparently hit a flock of birds, lost both engines, as we just heard from Bob, or a government official says they're going to be investigating this accident. Needless to say, we'll be following the story throughout the afternoon, and we'll be back on the air with any major developments and have complete details, of course, tonight on the CBS Evening News. For now, I'm Katie Couric, CBS News, New York. Tonight, miracle on the Hudson. A jetliner filled with passengers crashes in the frigid waters off Manhattan, and everyone on board survives. We'll have the latest on how the skill of the pilots and the heroics of first responders prevented a disaster.
This is the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric.
And good evening, everyone. As you can imagine, it was an incredible, almost surreal scene here in New York City. Just behind me in the Hudson River, a jetliner with more than 150 people on board actually floating here in the freezing waters. And one by one, every one of the passengers and crew was rescued. U.S. Airways Flight 1549 had just taken off from LaGuardia Airport in Queens for Charlotte, North Carolina, when it apparently hit a flock of birds, knocking out both of the plane's engines. Even without power, though, the pilots managed to maneuver the Airbus A320 northward over the Bronx, make a sharp turn south, then follow the Hudson River alongside Manhattan Island, losing altitude along the way, and finally coming to rest on the river. And then that's when, as Randall Pinkston tells us, emergency crews suddenly stepped into action. Randall?
Katie, considering the freezing temperatures and the speed of that plane when it hit the water, the passengers, the aviation experts, everyone says it's a miracle that everyone survived.
I'm sure we're all glad we're alive, man, so God bless.
U.S. Airways to Charlotte crash-landed in the Hudson River shortly after takeoff from New York's LaGuardia Airport.
Less than 2 minutes up in the air, it was a big boom. Everybody smelled smoke.
The captain came on and says, look, we're going down, brace for impact.
It was just moments into the flight when the plane's pilot radioed air controllers. He had lost both engines after hitting what may have been a flock of birds.
As we got lower and lower, the pilot said brace for impact.
Everyone kind of looked at each other and said some prayers. You know, I said about 5 Our Fathers, 5 Hail Marys, and we hit the water.
Witnesses watched as the plane began a gradual descent, reviving memories for some of September 11th.
It's coming down, 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 and just right in the water.
Yeah. We thought it was going to veer in and hit a building, actually.
It was pretty scary.
The plane then skimmed across the water 100 yards or more before coming to a rest just off Midtown Manhattan.
Right past the piers, and it just, no smoke, but it just landed. When it landed, threw up a whole bunch of water.
These photos show dozens of passengers huddled on the jet's wings waiting for rescue. Many New Yorkers could only watch from the windows of their office buildings, including CBS News.
As I looked out and I saw the life rafts come out, sort of open up from the plane, I grabbed a pair of binoculars and was able to see people standing on the aircraft wings. They seemed pretty calm. It wasn't so chaotic as I would expect it to be.
Nearby, commuter ferries pulled up within minutes, pulling aboard passengers and crew. Rescuers face 3 more challenges: a sinking airplane, frigid water, and strong currents pulling the jet downriver.
They did a phenomenal job getting everybody out. Phenomenal.
In an emergency, the Airbus jet is designed to fly on one engine to a nearby airport. But this seems to be the rare case when the plane lost both engines.
It is an extraordinarily rare event that both engines go out. It's not so unusual that a single engine goes out or you get hit and your windscreen gets cracked, but to lose both engines is a 1 in a million shot.
Many of the passengers are being treated at hospitals in New York and New Jersey for injuries, including shock and possible hypothermia.
What do you need a redo of?
A former military pilot once told me that anytime you can get off a plane safely, it's a good landing. Today, the pilot of that U.S. Air jet made a very good landing. Katie?
All right, Randall Pinkston. Randall, thanks very much. Now, you can only imagine the fear among the passengers during those few minutes. The plane was in the air and then, of course, landed in the water. Joining me now is David Sanderson. He was one of the last passengers out of the plane. And David, first of all, how are you doing right now? What were your experiences as a result of this? Do you have any injuries?
I'm much better now, Katie. Thank you for asking. The staff had done an outstanding job in taking care of me, so thank you to them. No, it was the pilot gets all the credit. When I was watching how it was coming down, there was no way he could have landed on ground. He did the right thing, so I give him all the credit. It was pretty much controlled chaos on the plane, and
Can you tell me, David, sort of what happened? Because I understand you were only in the air for about 6 minutes. Can you just give me the details of what transpired before the plane went into the water?
Yeah, I heard an explosion, and I looked down. I saw some flames coming out from underneath the wing, and I showed the guy next to me. I said something happened, but he should be able to land it. But unfortunately, he started coming down pretty quick. So once he said that brace for impact, pretty much everybody paid attention to him doing that. But then when he went down, it was pretty significant hit coming down. Fortunately for me, I just hit my head and I came back up. But getting people off the plane was quite a challenge. But everybody did the right thing and got off the plane. And we got the people on the lifeboat as quickly as we could. And fortunately, we got everybody out. And I was fortunate.
Was it a pretty? Yeah. I'm sorry. We're having some audio problems, David. I'm sorry to interrupt, but was it a pretty orderly evacuation?
As orderly as it could be under the circumstances. People were climbing over the seats and coming down the aisles, but it was for such a tragic situation. People did as well as they possibly could in the situation.
And you were the last one out of the plane. I understand you were actually in the plane after it landed for 7 minutes. Was it filling up with water? What was it like inside that plane for those 7 minutes?
Yeah, once we got everybody out, I stood in the plane to make sure everybody was out, and it was filling up pretty rapidly, and it got up to about waist level. And then when everybody was out in the lifeboats, I then stepped out on the edge there, and it was about knee deep at that point. And then stepped down the wing, and then it was waist deep again. And then at that point, the boats were already there taking people up, and I just jumped in and started trying to swim to the first boat I could find. So fortunately, someone pulled me up on the boat because I didn't have much use of my lower extremities at that point. And they pulled me up and threw me on the boat, and thank God that they did.
Well, we're very glad you're safe, and it sounds like you were very heroic in making sure that all those passengers were out. And do you have hypothermia or any physical ailments as a result of this?
Fortunately, feeling is coming back in my lower extremities right now, and other than a bang on the shin, I knew that I felt it when I jumped out. I'm good to go. So once again, they're taking great care of me here at the hospital.
All right. Well, we're really happy to hear that you're safe. David Sanderson, thanks so much for taking time out to talk with us tonight. We appreciate it so much.
You're welcome, Katie. Thank you.